Okay, so Pollination Nation. We'll talk a little bit about the pollinators. Some of you may know a lot about them. Some of you may know absolutely nothing about them and the challenges they face and how we as citizen scientists, I like to call all of us that, can help. So this is kind of just a really busy, get it, buzzy, infographic slide so that people can kind of see exactly how important pollinators are to our world in general. So you can see that we have a lot of native bees. There's a native bee there, but did you know, this is some really interesting information, that pollinators generate about $29 billion to US farm income. That's just a phenomenal number. Honeybees arrived 300 years ago. Before then, all native pollinators were the ones doing the work, the heavy lifting, so to speak. So we hear a lot about the colony collapse disorder and how our honeybees are imperiled, and that is true, but we do have a lot of native pollinators that do just as much heavy lifting as the honeybees do. Pollinators provide 1 of every 3 bites of food. So that's kind of a little staggering when you think about that, but it does ring true after you realize all the vegetables and everything else that's in the store and what would happen if we suddenly didn't have pollinators anymore. And that 90% of fruiting plants require pollinators. The remaining 10% are usually wind pollinated, and that pollinator diversity equals plant diversity. So the more pollinators that we have, the more diverse plants we'll have in the ecosystem. So let's meet the pollinators. So everybody knows about your typical pollinators like the honeybee and maybe some other miscellaneous bees and butterflies, but you probably don't think about all of them. So we've got a little moth here, we've got a carpenter bee, we've got a bat, we've got a hummingbird, and we've got a beetle. So we'll kind of talk about all the different types of pollinators that are out there, what attracts them, how can you bring them into your yard, that kind of thing. How can you help all of them, not just the butterflies and bees. So first we'll kind of start with bees. So this just happens to be a bumblebee and they're usually really fuzzy. And most of them are big. We have all sorts of different sizes though. So you might have some tiny little bitty ones and you have some larger ones. And they're usually identified by that pollen collection basket on their hind leg that is actually called a corbicula. Butterflies. So this is a skipper, and butterflies are probably one of the best known pollinators. They are very colorful and they're really pretty, and most people want to attract them to their yard. This is one of, I should have had a prettier one on there, but they're all pretty nonetheless. Flies. A lot of people don't think about flies, but flies are actually pretty prolific pollinators. You know, they'll carry pollen from one flower to another. You'll see bottle flies. And when I get to the end, when I'm talking about the pollinator census, we'll see some more examples of different type of flies, but they're not all what you would expect. Beetles. So beetles are kind of inadvertent pollinators. They like to actually eat the pollen. They're not there for the nectar like most of the other ones are. They prefer to munch on the flower or on the pollen, which is a very good protein source, but they crawl through the flowers and spread the pollen anyway, and so they get to be classified as a pollinator. Birds, probably the most famous bird, I guess. Some birds will pollinate inadvertently like the beetles do, but that would be the hummingbird. So they're obviously set up for pollination and getting nectar. That's their main food source. And they're very busy about it. They're pretty efficient and they can drink a lot of nectar. Bats. A lot of people don't think about bats. North American bats, most of those are going to be insectivores. So they're going to be eating mosquitoes and other types of insects, not necessarily nectar. Most of those you'll find are actually going to be in South America and areas that are probably more tropical in origin. And you will find some there. I take that back. You will find some out in the southwestern U.S. and into California, but not out here in Georgia. All we have are insectivores. All right, so let's take a little closer look at pollinators. So what attracts them to the flowers? So, and this goes for any type of a pollinator, a bird or a bug, or whichever in between. You're going to look at flower color, and it's not the same for every pollinator. Different types of pollinators will be attracted to different colors of flowers. And you'll notice that there are some adaptations within flowers to account for that. Flower odor. Not every flower smells really sweet. Some of them are really stinky, and that's to attract the pollinator that they prefer. And then deception. Deception can mean a couple different things. Sometimes flowers will grow in such a way that they will resemble the mate of one of the pollinators. They're wasps that kind of fall into this category. They will also exude smells that are really nasty, like death. That's to attract flies. So flowers are actually pretty cool when you think about what they can do with all of the adaptations to try to attract pollinators. Okay, native plants versus wildflowers. So, we're always kind of talking about, let's plant some wildflowers, out there, maybe in the power line right of way. Department of Transportation does that. Maybe you've got some place where you don't want to mow. The county does that also. And you'll see this wildflower and bird and butterfly mix in various different forms, whichever seed company you're looking at. So just so that you know and you're educated on it, native plants are typically those plants that were here before humans colonized. So those would be plants that are endemic to an area. Wildflowers can be both natives and they can be exotic, or plants that were introduced later after humans moved to the area. So native plants are sometimes referred to as wildflowers, but not all wildflowers are native plants. So just a FYI there. All right, hummingbirds of Georgia. So you're probably looking at this and going, I didn't know we had 3 hummingbirds. Well, we don't. We just have the middle one. That's the ruby throat. The ruby-throated male has obviously the iridescent red feathers around its throat. The female is kind of bland as comparison, and there are only resident hummingbirds. These other 2, this is just kind of some statistics for you. The calliope, it's the smallest bird in North America, and then the rufous has the longest migratory route at 3,000 miles. So that's pretty wild when you think about how far they travel. Most of the hummingbird species that we have in North America are actually found out in the West or the desert Southwest. They're not found over in Georgia or up into the Northeast. So as I alluded, there are adaptations for different types of pollinators. So some of the adaptations for hummingbirds include red flower colors. They're very attracted to the color red. Some of you probably noticed this. I know sometimes I've got a lot of pollinator plants in my yard. I might be outside with a red solo cup enjoying whatever, and I'll have a hummingbird come up and they'll buzz you. They'll just buzz right in front of you. And that's because they're attracted to the color that the cup is. They don't think that you're the most beautiful thing that they ever saw, or telling you, hey, go over and fill that feeder, lady. They prefer tubular flowers, or those are going to be very long flowers, because they have their beak and their tongue are very long. So they need to be able to reach down in there. And they prefer large amounts of sweet nectar. They are voracious little birds, and they can eat their weight in nectar daily. So it's very important to them that whatever they're feeding on has a large amount of whatever it is, whether it be your feeder or it be a flower. And the flowers need to be open during the daytime versus at night, which some flowers are. We'll talk about bats in a bit, and those only open at night. Bird pollinated flowers, nectar is typically in a long floral tube. You can see here in the aloe plant and a few others. So if you see a flower that looks a lot like this, it's likely because its targeted pollinator is going to be a hummingbird. You'll see that there's not a ton of fragrance to them, and they don't typically have anything for the bird to land on. So when you have a hummingbird feeder, it isn't necessary that you have a little perch on there for them. They're perfectly happy to just kind of hover and feed and then zoom off. So Georgia native plants for hummingbirds, there are quite a few out there. You have the cardinal flower or lobelia. This is kind of we consider this a wildflower, and it's probably where you see in a more naturalized setting more so than in a cultivated setting. So you can typically get this in those mixes of natives and wildflowers, but you'll see it spring up along the roadsides. It's pretty hardy. It can grow anywhere from a relatively wet area along a pond or a stream all the way into a dry meadow type situation, but it does prefer sun. And then you see the trumpet honeysuckle. This is Georgia's native honeysuckle. It's not invasive like the other type of honeysuckle that you'll see on roadsides. It grows quite slowly, and it is definitely preferred by the hummingbirds. You have red columbine. This is seen probably in more shadier part shade areas, and then Indian pinks. These are really pretty, and sometimes if you're trying to cultivate these and grow them in your yard, they're not as easy to grow as they should be, but you know, if you can get them to grow, they are definitely a favorite of hummingbirds. And we have the red buckeye. This is a beautiful tree, and there are quite a few different types of buckeyes. You know, we call them trees for bees, I guess, if you want to think about that. So we really encourage, and there are other organizations that encourage it too, that when you're planting trees on your property, try to look at trees that can be used for pollinators that have an interest for that. And red buckeye is a good one of that, a good choice for that. And then you have Monarda or bee balm. This happens to be the red variety. There is also a pinky variety. Very pretty, and if it's happy where it's growing, it will spread, but pollinators love this stuff. All right, some other hummingbirds that you might see here in Georgia. Most of these are just going to be, you know, maybe if you're lucky in a lifetime situation. The black-chinned, Anna's, broad-tailed, broad-billed, and the magnificent hummingbird, as well as Allen's. Those are all West Coast species, and they're on a different flyway than what we are. Flyway is basically just the migratory route and the home territory of where the birds are, and we really only have, as I mentioned before, the ruby-throated hummingbird. So adaptations for butterflies. So this is a butterfly on, this is a eastern tiger swallowtail on a buddleia bush or a butterfly bush. A lot of people have butterfly bushes. They're easy to find in the nurseries, all sorts of different varieties. Might suggest that you pick some of the more recent cultivars because they are less invasive. If you get some of the old-timey varieties, if you have them planted around an area with a lot of water, you will find that they will take over. So just be prepared for that, but they are, you know, really beloved by butterflies and other types of pollinators. Butterflies are attracted to lots of different colors. There's not one particular color in, you know, I guess in general, they are attracted to pretty much everything, but they do want flower clusters to land on, like you see here. They're not really attracted to sweet smells, and they do prefer to have some type of a floral tube with the nectar. So they all have long tongues, or the proboscis, and that's what they need to get down in there. So they're going to prefer flowers that have that floral tube, just kind of like what the hummingbird uses. You can see here the tongue or the proboscis that's extended, and one that's coiled. So everybody kind of knows what that looks like. So some native plants for butterflies. Garden phlox, there are some more recent varieties that are less subject to powdery mildew, but when you're planting them, make sure you have a lot of space in between the plants for airflow, and that'll make for a better garden. And then foxglove or Penstemon. So you'll notice again, it's got a deeper throat And that's, again, what the butterflies are looking for. There are other pollinators that look for that too. So you'll notice more than just the butterflies. Swamp milkweed, pretty much any milkweed. Swamp milkweed you have to kind of search for. Smaller nurseries like Randy's in Lawrenceville, Pike Nurseries occasionally will carry this, and some of the others around the area. Rarely will you see these at the big box stores. They are just not, it's more of a specialty plant, but definitely a good addition to a garden if you can get it. You'll also notice the native variety, or the orange Asclepias, that grows out in the power line right of ways, maybe along roadsides, that kind of thing. That butterfly weed, if you can get your hands on some of it, that works just as well too. And then we have another sage over here, a salvia. There are lots of different types of salvia that butterflies will like. These are just some native varieties. And deer tongue, and then we have the goldenrod. So, goldenrod is kind of found in the latter half of the summer. So it's kind of a last big hurrah for pollinators before they either have to migrate or hibernate, or before their short lives end. So adaptations for moths. So moths, obviously, mostly they feed at night. There are a couple moths, and you'll see those at the end, that are daytime feeders. One of the biggest ones that you're probably thinking of is the Sphinx moth or the hummingbird moth. So if you've been, and they really love butterfly bushes. So if you've been around a butterfly bush and you see this thing that looks like a hummingbird, but isn't a hummingbird, and you say, oh, that's a hummingbird. And no, it's a moth. In relation to the tomato hornworm. So if you have those big green worms on your tomatoes and you've been plucking them off and disposing of them, you might want to think twice and just plant some extra tomatoes, because that's what's going to produce that hummingbird moth, or a variety or a species of that hummingbird type moth. There are other plants that it will feed on, different species feed on different plants, but so I'm not going to go into the weeds on that, but just beware that you're not going to have as many hummingbird moths if you end their lives. But moths typically will prefer a white colored flower. They want something that's open at night, so that white color is kind of iridescent. And they prefer tubular flower, just like a butterfly does, because they have the proboscis just like a butterfly does. And they like large amounts of nectar. And here's just a picture so you can see how long their tongue is. It's pretty long. That looks like it's about 12 inches long. So rarely are you going to find a flower with a throat that long, but that just kind of gives you an idea of what you're looking at. And here's some columbines, and you can see the nectar spurs. So they're set up for butterflies and moths. Some more native plants for moths. You got unicorn root, and then you've got bottle brush buckeye. So there's another buckeye for you. It's a great native plant, very pretty. A great addition to a landscape if you're trying to plant natives. Nodding onion. It looks a little bit like an ornamental garlic, and then you've got the eastern persimmon. So sometimes you don't even really see the persimmon flowers. You might have American persimmons in your yard, and you really don't see the flowers. It's just when later on in the summer when you see the green fruits, and then in the fall, the persimmon fruits before they fall on the ground. And persimmons are great not only for pollinators, but also for wildlife in the area. If you ever want to have an interesting time, just set up a trail cam near a persimmon tree and you'll see all sorts of wildlife. It's pretty amazing. And then we have southern beard tongue and wild bergamot. You'll notice on the bergamot that it's also a Monarda species, and it's just a little bit different. Very pretty nonetheless, again, just a native, but consider adding that in to your garden. So now we'll move on to bees. And as I mentioned before, different pollinators will prefer different colors. So with bees, they prefer yellow, blue, and white. And they don't have a really long proboscis like a butterfly or a moth, so they need a short tube. They prefer sweet scents, so that's what helps attract them. And they look at ultraviolet patterns, so that's different from some of the other pollinators that we were looking at. And here's just an example, so you can see what these flowers look like under UV light. So you can see there's different patterns to them that you wouldn't see unless you could see in that UV spectrum. So that's kind of interesting. And bees are attracted to all sorts of different flowers. You can see here you've got henbit. That's that creepy green stuff in your Bermuda or zoysia that grows out with purple flowers if you forgot to put your pre-emergent in to control that. And then you have Joe Pyeweed. That's a favorite of our solitary bees. Well, any bee or pollinator grows a lot around in the ditches, but it's a great native addition. They grow very tall. Sunflowers, so large flowers, and then you've got some Carolina geraniums also. Beetle pollinators. So I mentioned before, beetles are kind of an inadvertent pollinator. They're very clumsy. Most of them are kind of big and they don't move with any grace. So they're kind of just blundering through whatever flower, munching as they go. So they don't have very good vision, so they like high contrast flowers, so whites, yellows, that kind of thing, and they are active during the day. So you'll frequently find beetles in large tree flowers like a tulip poplar, maybe a dogwood, or a magnolia. A lot of these kind of grow in a cup shape, and so that kind of helps the beetle because, like I said, they're kind of clumsy, so they don't have to worry as much about falling out. But they also like flowers that grow close to the ground, like wild ginger. But again, it's got to be fairly light colored because they have poor vision, and they do like smelly, fruity, or spicy type flowers because that helps attract them. So just some examples of beetle pollinated flowers. So you can have a large flowered coreopsis, although there are some smaller varieties that you'll find like in the power line right of ways. They grow in, usually bloom in September, and then green and golds. Fly pollinators. So flies are one of those that are attracted to unusual scents, probably not ones that we would find that smelled good. So they, of course, like spicy or rotten smells. Some of you might know what the corpse flower is. We don't have those, but you can find them usually in botanical gardens, and they smell like a corpse, but they also attract a lot of flies because they're really stinky. And flies typically prefer red, purple, and blue flowers. So you can see here, this is a passion flower vine. Not only is it good food for flies and other pollinators, but it's a host plant for several different species of swallowtail butterflies. They don't offer any reward to the flower, so flies have to be kind of fooled by the flower to come in, and that's usually where the stinky smell comes in. So some types of fly pollinated flowers, Echinacea or coneflower, purple coneflower. If you've ever smelled them, there's not a ton of scent to them, but they don't smell that great. Copper iris, some irises, they don't smell that great either. Now moving on to how can we help as citizen scientists and those who want to help preserve pollinator populations. So planting a pollinator garden, it can be something as small as a pot that you put on your patio if you live in an apartment, or a bunch of pots. Or you can put a raised bed out there that's, you know, a 2x4 or something like that. It doesn't have to be a half an acre or an acre in size. But if you have that, then, you know, more power to you, because it becomes a more naturalized area. You don't have to maintain it, except for maybe some deadheading of the blooms and dividing of the plants. But it can be a source of joy that you work on and you know, enjoy getting out in the garden and doing all of that stuff, and you're helping the pollinators. So picking a variety of blooms is kind of key here. You want to get a bunch of different colors and a bunch of different shapes and sizes, because you're wanting to be attractive to all different types of pollinators. You also want to plant in drifts and in clusters. So instead of planting like one plant and then a different type of plant, plant them in groups of 3s or 5s or 7s, depending on how much space you have. And then you want to use minimal mulch, and you want to kind of avoid landscape fabrics. And this is kind of going to be because a lot of the detritus that falls down at the end of the summer, at the end of the year when these flowers are going to die back, that's going to provide a nursery area or an overwintering area for a lot of those pollinators. So you don't want to disturb it and rake it all out if you can help it. You want to kind of leave that there because a lot of those smaller pollinators will overwinter there, and then they'll emerge in the spring, and that's a good thing. So this is just kind of an example of what to plant. I plucked this one off of the Pollinator Census website, but you can kind of see it's just a very simple landscape plan. You could put that in a raised bed in your backyard. You've got some butterfly milkweed, that's the orange stuff there in the top middle. You've got giant blue hyssop, that's really pretty. That's kind of in the ultraviolet range. Bees love that stuff. Catmint, your cat will like it too, but the bees really love it. You've got some tick seed, which is Coreopsis, just like I'd mentioned, grows out in power line right of ways, really pretty. You've got an aster there, again, in the blue color range, and that'll tick off the ultraviolet range. Coneflower. So you've got a bunch of different plants here, but this isn't, of course, the end list. There's all sorts of other things that you can plant, but this is just a suggestion. And again, we mentioned native plants and how they're great to have out there. There are some native plant nurseries that specialize in that. So Baker Environmental, Beach Hollow Farms, Blue Meadows Farms, although some of, like I said, the other nurseries will have native plants interspersed with the exotics. These specialize in natives. So what can we do as good citizens or stewards of the environment? So just like we kind of talked to people here at Extension about how to get rid of stuff, we had a lot of how do you get rid of a snake, or how do you get rid of the voles in my lawn, that kind of thing. The same thing, same advice goes for how do we attract animals or pollinators. So you're going to create a habitat. You have to make it inviting for them so that they want to come in. How are you going to offer food sources to them? Are you going to plant lots of flowers and trees at all times of the year so that they have a continuous nectar source? That's a good idea if you can do that. And then provide shelter. So like I mentioned in the planting beds, don't clean out all of the detritus underneath. Leave some of that because that's where they're going to overwinter. So offering food sources, you're going to provide year-round for hummingbirds. Most people know they're here usually May through August, but there are some that will hang out and overwinter. So make sure if you're going to feed them, go ahead and leave that feeder out all year round and make sure it's clean. They are very susceptible to getting mold and getting sick from mold, and they don't need the fermented sugar water either. So if you're going to provide it, make sure that you're good about taking care of that. You can also use ant motes and yellow jacket proof feeders because those will easily overtake the feeder and then you won't get the birds. For butterflies and bees, you can provide puddle feeders. Butterflies like seeps because they can get minerals from them. And you can also provide the rotten fruit that will attract several different species of butterflies. You also want to provide a host plant. So host plants are what the caterpillars of butterflies will feed off of prior to getting in that chrysalis and then metamorphosizing into a butterfly. So you've got some dill, you'll find that, fennel, they'll feed on that. Passion flower, I had mentioned that before. Lots of milkweed plants. You have down there with the large caterpillar in the bottom left, that one looks like a tulip poplar. So there are a lot of different trees and plants out there that are host plants. I would suggest maybe reading up on some of them. You might be shocked at what the caterpillars can use as host plants, but they all have their preferences. So you can attract different ones depending on what's in your yard. Consider nectar availability. So it's best if you can offer nectar all year round. We do here in Georgia have the ability to do that, unlike some of the northern states where it's just too cold. But you have a winter flowering plants here. So it is possible to feed pollinators all year round. Sometimes honeybees, you'll see them out there in a 70-degree day in the middle of December or January. And then they'll go back into their hive, or if it's a solitary bee, it'll go back and hide in its burrow or under some detritus in a planting bed. So just, if you can, plant something for all year round so that you have flowers all year round. And know your garden. So know what you need to do. Do you need to deadhead your flowers? Is it time to check your soil, so that soil fertility, so that you know if you need to add some fertilizer for your flowers? When you're purchasing flowers, you want to know if they have treated them with neonicotinoids. It always trips me up. Neonicotinoids. So, that's going to take care of pests, but it is also really detrimental to bees. So you have to be aware of that. And now it's labeled. So be cautious and always read labels when you're going to do that. And then know the soil conditions that those plants need, the amount of sunlight they need, the amount of water, that kind of thing. Most of that's going to be available on the tag that you get. So know in your yard where these conditions exist and try to plant in those particular areas so the plants will thrive. You also want to provide shelter. So these are for solitary bees. So you'll get the mason bees and the leaf cutters, and that's just bamboo that's a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. And those little bees will go in there, and that's where they raise their brood. You have to clean them out every other year or so. But yeah, they're a great addition to just leave them on your porch if you have an open porch and a covered area. And pretty soon you'll have little bees living in them. They also, solitary bees also live in holes in your yard, digger bees. So sometimes it's usually mid-June, we'll start getting calls from people saying, I've got all these bees that are flying over my grass. How do I get rid of them? Well, you don't, you just wait. They're out there looking for some sweet love, and they're just doing their thing. So kind of just maybe don't cut the grass that week and let them find their mate. And then in another week or so, they're gone and they've completed their life cycle. So that's how you can help them. Just leave them be. Don't spray. So I know some of us really like our yards and we want them to look really nice. And sometimes if you have insects that you're not really happy about and you want to spray, you just have to be very careful about how you do that. So know when pollinators are most active, and that's during daylight hours. So if you have to spray an insecticide, try to do that at dusk. And that's because most pollinators won't be active at that time. So you don't want any drift that will accidentally kill a lot of those bees like you see here happened. You're just trying to do the best you can to protect them, even though you want to take care of some of the plants that you have. All right, let's move on to the Great Pollinator Census. So I mentioned that at the beginning of the talk, and that is every year. It's basically the same time every year. This year it's August 19th and 20th, and that's a Friday and a Saturday. So all Georgia citizens, we call them citizen scientists, can come together and, oops, I should be saying the 4th pollinator census. I forgot to change that. So it's the 4th this year. So 3 of these years make a nice trend line, and we've seen an increase in some species and a decrease in others. And, we'll keep kind of watching to see what happens, but anybody can participate. So, families, school groups, scout groups, individuals, and maybe the city of Norcross would be interested in doing that in their new pollinator garden. We'd be happy to give all sorts of information on that. So the goals of this particular program are to create or add additional sustainable pollinator habitats across Georgia. And we have some good information available on the website, and you'll see that shortly if you want to go take a look, that shows that Gwinnett County is actually one of the top counties in the entire state for creating pollinator habitat from the beginning of this program. So it ranks in the top 3, I believe. So we've seen a lot of pollinator habitat created, maybe because of the awareness of this program, but it's great, and we hope that we'll continue to see that. And that's also to increase the entomological literacy of our citizens. So by the time you get done doing some observations, hopefully you'll be able to tell a carpenter bee from a bumblebee, from a honeybee, from a sweat bee. And you'll know a little bit more about them and what they feed on and how you can help them. And then, of course, to generate useful information about the pollinator populations out there, so we can kind of track any up or down trends if we need to be aware that something's going to happen, like a population crash, and maybe be able to head that off at the pass. So the biggest thing with the pollinator census is whatever garden you're going to be using, whether it's one that you guys have created for the city or one in your backyard, is make sure that your pollinator garden includes plants that will be blooming in August. And here's an example. So this is something you can take a snapshot of, although I will provide this slide deck at the end so that you guys can have that in a recording so that you can go back and take a look. But these are all plants that will be blooming in August that pollinators like. And then we have specific categories that these insects will fall into. And this is what we've been tracking for the last 3 years, and what we will be tracking for the 4th year as well. And that's carpenter bees, bumblebees, honeybees, small bees, wasps, flies, butterflies and moths, and then other insects. So let's go take a look at the categories. First, we have the carpenter bee. So when I say the word carpenter bee, I probably, if I could see everybody's faces, you probably would all be grimacing and going, oh, I hate those. They burrow into my deck and my house and my soffits and fascia. I hate those things. Well, yes, we all hate them, but they are very effective pollinators, and they do have a place in nature. So that is one that we are watching. And with carpenter bees, they're pretty easy to identify once you know what you're looking for. So male carpenter bees are going to have that yellowish or whitish dot or spot on the front of their face. So if you've ever been outside and you've had one that's come and it buzzes in front of you, a lot of times that'll be the male, and you can tell that by the dot on his face. But the biggest thing is they don't have any hair on their abdomen. So they have a shiny abdomen. And that's pretty easy to identify when you're seeing them on a flower. They're, like I said, they're very effective pollinators, but that's an easy way to identify them between a bumblebee. They also have dense hair on their head and a fairly thick body. And then we have that compared to the bumblebee. So you can easily see bumblebees are really fuzzy. They're pretty easy to tell between a carpenter bee once you know those differences. So as I mentioned, bumblebees have hairy abdomens, where the carpenter bees have a shiny one, and they have dense yellow, black, and sometimes white hair, depending on what species it is. And here you can see a fuzzy little bumblebee with their pollen basket, or the Corbicula. And here's the differences between the two. So you can see the bumble on the left and the carpenter bee on the right. So if you see them together, you're like, oh yeah, I see what you're talking about. And again, just so you can see. So I didn't say this, our Becky Griffin, the specialist who is on this program, she came up with that fuzzy bum and a shiny hiney. I was told that that's from somewhere up north in New York, which maybe she's from up there, I'm not sure, but it's cute. It's an easy way to remember it. Next is honeybees. Honeybees are pretty easy to identify when you see them out there as compared to bumbles and carpenters. They're kind of a more uniform brownish yellow with stripes color. And, with short brown hairs kind of covering their abdomen. And again, you can see here a honeybee in the background and then a bumble in the front. Pretty easy to tell apart once you see them. And then small bees. So if it's not falling into the bumblebee category or the carpenter bee category, then it's probably going to be a small bee. And small bees can be all sorts of them. So there's leaf cutters. These are a lot of these are the solitary bees that live in those bee houses or that burrow into the ground that I showed you the picture of in the yard. Furrow bees, mining bees. Yeah, there's all sorts of different types of solitary or small bees. And these are all going to be small, like I said, smaller than those other two, the bumbles and the carpenters. And then small bees, again, leaf cutters, sweat bees. Sweat bees are pretty easy to distinguish. Most of they're in the family Helictidae, and they're going to be kind of an iridescent color, like an iridescent green or an iridescent blue. A lot of times they get into the crook of your arm when you're outside and you're sweating and they sting you there. So even though they're kind of annoying, they are definitely very good pollinators and we want to protect them as much as we can. But they are kind of pretty if you look at them like in this picture here. Flies. That was the surprise category. A lot of people probably didn't realize were pollinators. So you have a bottle fly here, but different types. And most people probably didn't realize that there were different types of flies. So you have a long-legged fly, you have the blue bottle fly, you have a crane fly, and the tachnid fly. He's kind of ugly, but he's still pretty useful as a pollinator. And then you have this guy. He's pretty interesting. So I threw him in here just because of, a little science lesson. So he's a bee mimic. It's actually a fly that resembles a bee. So you can see he's kind of got the eyes that look a little bit like a honeybee and a little bit the abdomen looks like a honeybee, but he definitely, if you took the coloration away, he's got fly wings and a fly body. This is called Batesian mimicry, and it's a way of getting predators to go, oh, I don't want to eat that because it's going to sting me. So it has no defenses, but it's using its appearance to fake out the predator. So they'll be less likely to be eaten. Very smart. Next up, we have wasps, and these guys are pretty easy to tell. They have that very long, skinny thorax with the big abdomen. So wasps are easy to tell apart. And we have all sorts. I mean, you have striped wasps. You have some really pretty iridescent green and blue wasps. There's a large variety out there, and both in size and coloration. But they're also very effective pollinators. Here's just a couple examples. The paper wasp, potter wasps. They're pretty hairless for the most part. And they, again, have the very narrow waist. So it's pretty easy to tell what they are when they're on a flower. And just as an aside, a lot of people, when they see that striped hornet-looking insect, they automatically go to yellow jackets. But just so you know, yellow jackets are not seen on flowers very often. So that automatically, for the most part, excludes them from the count. Butterflies. So here we have the monarch on the bottom. That's a very well-known butterfly. We have some here, not many. We're not really in their flyway. That would be more up in North Georgia, the gray hair streak and the Gulf fritillary. Moths, as I mentioned in the first part of the presentation, we do have some daytime moths. There aren't very many of them. Mostly you're going to be doing this count in the daytime. You're not going to be doing it at night because you're going to miss all the other pollinators. I guess if you really wanted to count the nighttime moths, you probably could do one. But anyway, skate moth, you might have looked at it, from a distance and thought, oh, that's a lightning bug or something like that. But no, that's not what that is. The webworm moth and the sphinx or the hawk moth that you might think was a hummingbird. And then we have the other category. So there's a katydid in there. And those will be praying mantises ambush bugs, wheel bugs, lady beetles, those kind of things. Some of them are carnivorous, so they're not pollinators. They may inadvertently pollinate by jumping from flower to flower, looking to pick off some of the pollinators, but they're keeping track of those too. They just fall into the other category. So how do you do the census? Well, that's pretty simple. Excuse me. This is from Gwinnett County. So they work with us to come up with a good design that we can use to pass out to folks who are interested in doing the pollinator census. So you have on the right your cheat sheet that tells you what you're looking for in the different categories. And then on the left, you have your observation sheet. And if you're interested in going to any of the events that they put on, because they have some in their parks, they also, if you're familiar with Harvest Gwinnett, which is a newer program of community gardens in Gwinnett County, where you can go and lease a plot. If you don't have any at your house or your apartment, you can go lease a plot. They're in 9 parks all around the county, and it's very reasonable. I think it's like $35 for a year. But they have events there at most of those. So plenty of places that you can be involved, and we're trying to get new businesses and other places to host these every year. So the number increases every year, which is great. So first, you're going to pick a blooming pollinator plant that has a lot of activity. So this is a purple coneflower. You can see a Gulf fritillary on that. So it's something that's blooming in August, something that's a good pollinator plant that has a lot of activity. And if you're going to the store, you're going to go to Randy's Perennials or someplace else and buy some stuff to plant, and you're like, I wonder what I should buy. Well, just watch what the pollinators are doing. If you see a particular species of plant that's just covered up in pollinators, buy that one because they really like it. So it not only will be good for them, but it'll be great if you're doing the observations later in the year, because you'll have a ready-made pollinator plant that you know that they like. Next, for 15 minutes, you can time this, you're going to count each time an insect touches a bloom, even if they fly away and return. And you just make little hatch marks each time an insect in that category touches the flower. A wasp, small bee, carpenter bee, that kind of thing. And then third, you just upload your observations that you did for those 15 minutes to this website. And they usually leave it open from the end of August all the way through the end of September. And if you don't want to do that, you can just come to one of the free events that we have, and we will collect all the observations and upload them for you. And with that, I am done. And I have 8 minutes left to take any questions. So I will stop screen sharing and come back. And if anybody has any questions, if they want to type those in the chat box, Cindy will read them off and I will try to answer.
All right, Lisa. Lily has a question. She says, if you have existing host plants in your yard that attract certain pollinators, should you coordinate other pollinator plants to feed them throughout their life cycle? Or should you add plants that attract other pollinators for more variety?
You can do both. But if you're stuck on space and you really don't have a lot of space, then I would consider planting both the host plant, and that's the plant that the caterpillar will feed on if it's a butterfly, and then make sure that you also have the habitat or the mulch or the detritus underneath, or a place for that butterfly to emerge safely. So have a buffer between where your grass is and where the planting bed is or something like that, so you don't have to worry about injuring the insect when it emerges. If you have more space, then certainly get some additional plants that would attract other types of pollinators. So if you've only got stuff for butterflies or bees, why not put some tubular flowers out for hummingbirds, or we don't have the bats here for real to be able to plant for that. Just as an aside, you're probably wondering what plants bats will pollinate, and that would be like mangoes or bananas or guavas. So we're not tropical, so we're not going to be able to have those. But yeah, you can, plant for moths, or just go for an additional pollinator. Check off another one on the list that you've been able to help.
All right, thank you. Erin has a question. She says, so is August the best time to have flowers for our pollinators?
All year is really the best time. Here in Georgia, obviously, it can be 70 degrees in February and March and April, and then it can get cold again. But pollinators will actually emerge in those warm times. I have, the name escapes me at this point, but it looks a little bit like a, oh shoot, I can't remember the name. Anyway, it bloomed in early January when we were kind of going through that in between the cold snap and the warm snap in December. And I had all sorts of bumblebees on that thing. And then the next week it was in the 20s. So they'll emerge when it's warm. So if you can not just plant something that's going to bloom in August, that's just simply so that you have something to count on. But instead, if you're going to plan your yard out, try to add things in that will bloom all throughout the year. Things that will bloom in the spring, things that will bloom in the winter, things that will bloom midsummer and late summer. That's to help the pollinators out so that you don't have a drought, so to speak, for food.
All right, thank you, Lisa. And I don't see any other questions.
Okay. Well, this has been recorded, so I will provide a link to the recording on YouTube that you'll get later on. So if you want to go back and screenshot anything, that's okay. And if you have, I'll put my email in the chat box. So if you have any questions about pollinators and what I've talked about today, or if you have just any questions in general, we answer all sorts of stuff here at Extension. We do water and soil testing, fertility, water testing for contaminants, things of that nature. But you might have a squirrel in your attic and you want to know how it got there and how to get it out. I can help you with that. Why you have maggots in your toilet. Yes, that's a true story. I can help you with that. We are kind of the Sherlock Holmes of natural resources over here. So, and if we don't know it, then we have all of the specialist PhDs at UGA that help us out. So, we're here to kind of help the public, and I enjoyed this. This is great. So thanks for coming, everybody. Lily, did you have anything else?
No, that covers it. And thank you so much. That was
Okay.
a lot of really good information. So I'm excited to maybe watch it again.
Okay,
Take better
fantastic.
notes. So thank you.
All right. Well, you got 2 minutes. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end this, and then I'll try to have everything to Lily to send out by next week. Thanks, everybody.